Hello, welcome to my daily gardening and one farm. Today we are going to be discussing more about worms, helping those who are interested in worm farming to understand a bit more about worms. So, when it comes to composting worms, there are a lot of conflicting information out there. For example, some will tell you that Nightcrawlers are not good composting worms, and some will tell you that they are good composting worms. There are so many different types of earthworms. All worms are earthworms, but there are some species of them that are very good composters, and there are some that are not. Now, among those that are composters, there are those that you cannot raise them in a raised bed. So, for example, the regular earthworms, these you cannot raise in. Oh, hi, Healthy. You're walking your dog. Okay, nice. Yes, so there are those that are good composting worms, but they don't do well in a worm bin. So you just have to let them stay in your garden. And then there are those that you can raise in a worm bin. So the regular earthworms are not very good composters when placed in a worm bin because they tend to want to burrow down deep into the soil. And if you put them in a worm bin, they're going to try to burrow down through the bottom of your worm bin and they're going to end up harming themselves. So for that reason, they are better they're better off if you just leave them in your garden and not try to put them in a worm bin. So when you have regular earthworms, oh hi Chanel, I'm glad that you could join the live. Yes. So the regular earthworms, you just want to leave them in place in your garden. But then if you want to increase the population of them in your garden, oh, hi Russell, all you need to do is just keep on adding organic matter to the garden, and that will help them to increase their population in the garden. So while you might not get the full benefit as if you were raising them like composting worms, they are still going to be in your soil, eating the organic matter and converting it into worm castings, which is going to produce the nutrients for your plants. And in addition to that, they are very good tunneling worms, which means that they're helping you to aerate your garden. And they're also not just aerating your garden, but these tunnels that they create in the soil, it creates a pocket or a tunnel for your water to reach to the root of your plant. So for this reason, even though you cannot compost regular earthworms, at least you want to increase their population because it is still very, very important for your garden. Now, as I mentioned, some worms are better composters than others. Now, what are some of the best composting worms that you can find out there? The most common ones are the red wiggler, the tiger worms, the European nightcrawlers, the African nightcrawlers, the Canadian nightcrawlers. There are other composting worms, some of which are popular, but then there are some composting worms that it is best for you not to raise them at all. So I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later on. So red wigglers, you might notice I said red wigglers and I also said tiger worms because although I mentioned the two, they're actually the same worm. But there are some people who are not aware that tiger worms are the same as red wigglers. And so if you mention red wigglers, they will ask you, what about tiger worms? Or if you mention tiger worms, then they may ask you, what about red wigglers? But red wigglers and tiger worms are actually the same type of worms. So red wigglers, they're actually known by many different names. In fact, among the composting worms, I think red wigglers have the most different names. So they are known as red wigglers, they're known as tiger worms, they're known as red worms, trout worm, panfish worms, manure worms, brandling worms, and then their scientific name is Eisenia fetida. Yes, you're correct, Russell. They're both Eisenia fetida. Yes, so they have quite a few different names, but they are the same worms. Now, these worms, the red wigglers, they are said to be the best composting worms. There are some who may not agree, but in general, if you asked people about what worms to get when you want to start your worm bin, the first thing most people will tell you, especially if it is someone who have had experience with more than one types of composting worms, is that you are to get red wigglers. So there are other type of composting worms. Some of them can be invasive. So what makes red wriggler one of the best composting worm? For one, they are among the fastest reproducers among the species of composting worms. They reproduce very, very quickly. So because of that, you know that you can have worms consuming a lot of your food scraps very fast. Let's see. Okay. Well, P says, wow, so many names and good to know because yes, I have heard people call them tigers and I didn't know that they were what they were referring to. Okay. Yes. So another thing that makes them such good composting worm is that they are able to withstand a wider range of temperature changes than most other composting worms. Um, they are surface dwellers. They usually dwell in around the top 6 inches of organic matter or soil. And then because they are top feeders, it makes them ideal for you to use them in the worm bins because then they won't always be trying to burrow down deep into the soil. The nightcrawlers, these are burrowing worms, and so they will tend to want to burrow down. They are good composters as well, of course, but then they do burrow down from time to time, and depending on which one you have, sometimes they will burrow down and they just not come back up where you can have access to them. So, yes. And another thing that makes the red wrigglers such a good composting worms are better than the rest or preferred than the rest is that they reach their maturity state very early, at least earlier than the other composting worms, which means that this also help with their rate of reproduction. They produce more cocoons per week than other types of composting worms. So by doing this, they are constantly increasing their population at a larger rate than other composting worms. So the more mouths to feed, the more castings you're going to get. So these are some of the things that make red wrigglers so versatile. Let's see. Russell says they are the least sensitive to bad bacteria and can tolerate the widest swings in temperatures. Definitely so. Definitely so. When I just bought my worms for the first time, I was told that they cannot be allowed to freeze because if they freeze, they're going to die. And yes, if they freeze, they're going to die. But then there is always, what do you call it now? Yes, there is always some clause or some loophole, if you may call it, a because as most of you who are on the line, My red wigglers, a lot of them froze. They weren't frozen long enough for them to die. So most of them, anything that remained in the bin while the freezing occurred, they survived because I was able to thaw them out within a week of them freezing. So they cannot survive some amount of freezing, but you don't want them to be in an environment where they're going to be frozen for any long time, because then they will definitely die. But yes, the red wigglers can tolerate a wide range of. Let's see, LP says, I separated red wigglers from my compost worm mix with all the blues. Okay. I started a new bin with about 100 red wigglers, and now there are many, many more. Nice. But I wanted to increase the number of red wigglers. Okay. All the best with that, my dear. I'm glad they are doing well. With time, you will have a lot of them all to themselves. I'm sure some of those blue worms might sneak into that bin though, like they did with my Canadian nightcrawlers, when a few of them, just a few of them, escaped into the Canadian nightcrawler bin, and they stayed there. Oh, hi, Han White. They stayed there and started increase their population, and so I decided that I'm going to just take out all of the adults Canadian nightcrawlers and restart the bin with those, so that I can have a pure bin with Canadian nightcrawlers. And then the bin that was contaminated with both the Canadian nightcrawlers and the red wigglers, I would raise that by itself. So I was very surprised when a couple months later I go back to the bin. I took out the worms, I didn't take out the castings, I washed the dirt off them and started the bin. But then the bin was not in any location where the red wigglers could actually crawl into it, because I keep it in a separate location from the red wigglers. But even after doing all of that, I still end up with red wigglers being in that bin. And if you have seen one of my previous videos, I had nearly about 2 to 3 pounds of red wigglers in that bin. So hopefully, when you separated your red wigglers, you found some way to ensure that none of the blue worms got in there, so you can have a pure red wriggler bin. Let's see. Oh, you're on the road. Okay. I thought it was in an hour. Okay. Don't worry, we all make those mistakes from time to time. I'm glad that you were able to join us though, or you are able to join us. Yes, so European night crawlers, how can you identify them? Because they tend to look similar to the red wigglers, and when they are not fully mature, sometimes depend, because sometimes they can be mature but they are small in size because they're still young. But sometimes it can be difficult to tell them apart from the red wigglers. So what can you use to identify the European night crawlers? Well, the European night crawlers tend to be bluish or a pinkish gray color, and then they tend to have a band or a striped appearance. The tip of their the tip of their tail tends to be cream or pale yellow, and it is said that if they are not feeding properly, then the worms can become pale pink. Let's see, LP says, I haven't seen any yet. They are not close enough, so I think. Likely they'll dry up before they get into the red wriggler bin. But I have found the blues in the CNC bin. Okay. Yes, because they do say those blue worms, they are travelers, and as far as I hear, they can travel pretty far. Yes, so hopefully they don't get into that bin. Yes. So where can you find these European night crawlers though? The European night crawlers can be found practically all over the globe. They, as the name suggests, oh, I'm Makila, hey? Um, the They are, as the name suggests, they are originally from Europe, but then over the years, as people become more familiar with composting, so they start transporting these European night crawlers. So now they can be found all over. So the red wrigglers and the European night crawlers are actually the two most popularly raised composting worms. And we can see where it makes sense that the European nightcrawler is going to be among the very popular ones because, like the red wrigglers, they can survive a wide temperature range too. Yes. The thing with raising the European night crawlers, though, is that they are less tolerant to being disturbed than the red wrigglers. They don't like to be disturbed. And the European night crawlers, they're even less tolerant to acidic environment than the red wrigglers. Let's see, Russell says, I have been thinking of going through the Euros and separating the octadras from the venetas and relabel as reds. Both species plump up to 1.5 grams. Okay, okay, that's good to know. Yes, so these European night crawlers, they do not reach maturity state as quickly as the red wrigglers. In fact, the red wrigglers, they reproduce, they reach maturity state a week before the European night crawlers. They reach their maturity state a week before the night crawlers. So the red wrigglers are always a week ahead of the European night crawlers. Now the red wrigglers can lay 3 cocoons in a week, while the European night crawlers tend to lay around 2 cocoons per week. The red wigglers, they will incubate within 14 to 21 days, whereas it will take the European night crawlers about 21 to 28 days to incubate. And whereas you will get an average of about, say, 3 worms from the red wriggler cocoons, you will get an average of 2 from the European night crawlers. So the red wrigglers actually reproduce more than the European night crawlers. But given that the worms tend to eat at the same rate, half to their full body weight in a day, so the European night crawlers are larger, which means that each worm is able to eat more. Because the regulars run at a fast rate, so you end up having the same volume of worms, even though you might have a larger number of red wigglers. Let's see, Russell says the octadras are smaller and redder. Okay, there's always so much to learn from you, Russell. Okay, so the red wigglers, the red wrigglers 56 days to reach their maturity. Of course, worms can control even how early they reach their maturity rate. So it all depends on the condition that is in their bin because, as I've said in previous lives, If worms realize that they're in a situation where their lives are threatened, then they're going to be laying more cocoons, and they are going to be growing at a much faster rate because they are doing everything that they can in order to preserve their species. Russell says they are shorter and fatter when at 1.5 grams, as the hot hortensis is longer at 1.5. Okay. Russell wants to know, what are you referring to, Russell? Subspecies or something to that effect? I think he's using the scientific names of some of these worms. Yes, so can actually affect their colors. Interesting, isn't it? Yes, the food they eat can actually affect their colors. Now, the Asian jumping worms, that is one of the invasive species of worms. So the Asian jumping worm, it is known by many different type of worms, by different it is known by many different types of names. So it is called the Asia jumping worm. It is called the Alabama jumping worms. It's called snake worms, crazy worms, and stuff like that. Originally, it is out. It is found in Japan and Korea, but as people travel a lot from those areas, those Asian countries, then the worms accidentally got transported, whether on their shoes or stuff like that. So after a while, it starts to show up in the US, and gradually it has been spreading to other locations, including Canada. Now, these worms are said to be invasive because just one, you know that worms are hermaphrodite. They can change their sex organ whenever they're ready. And even though they're hermaphrodite, it usually takes two worms in order for them to reproduce. That is not the case with the Alabama jumping worms. These worms they just need one, just one, and that one can become an invasion in your area. So, for that reason, it's not recommended that you use them either for fishing or to raise them as composting worms, because they will devastate whatever area you put them in. They're very good for fishing bait, but then, and they're good for fishing bait because when you put them in the water, they are very aggressive and this is going to attract the fish. But they are not good to raise because they will devastate whatever area you have. They will deplete all of the organic matter that you have in your environment in no time. It does not take much for them to consume all of the organic matter. And we feed organic matter to worms because we want the byproduct, we want the worm castings. So one might look at it and say, yes, this is a good thing, but where the Alabama jumping worm is concerned, that is not necessarily so, because they don't only feed on plants that are dying, they will feed on living plants as well. And in addition to that, wherever they go and invade that area, nothing tends to want to grow in that region. So, and the casting usually damage the surroundings, drying it out. And then because they consume the organic matter that is in their region so quickly, they are destroying the habitat for a lot of the beneficial insects or other beneficial creatures that are around. So for that reason, it is recommended that if you have them, then you destroy them. Let's see, Russell says, because of the jumpers, lost I lost a woods that I used to hunt mushrooms in. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah. And it doesn't really take much. It doesn't really take much for them to become a danger because they can reproduce all by themselves. Yeah, so whenever these Alabama jumping worms invade any region, that region is usually inhospitable for plants and for some living organism. And according to Sam Shan, he's um, he's an invasive species specialist in Oregon, and he says that these worms will actually reduce the leaf litter by as much as 90% in one single season. So 90 to 95% in just one season. So that is how invasive, how dangerous they are to the natural environment. So not only do they remove soil that is covering the nutrients for plants, but they will also remove the natural habitats, as I mentioned before, for these beneficial insects. They can even change the chemistry of the soil. They can change the fungi, they can change the bacteria and the microbes that are in the soil. So yes, that is why we don't want or we don't recommend composting with these Alabama jumping worms, because it's not really worth it because the damage that they can do is just too much. Let's see. Russell says they destroy the forest floors, not even oyster mushrooms up in the trees. Wow. Yeah, these creatures, they are terrible to be around, but there are many people who actually like to raise them because they like to use them for the fishing or even just for the castings. But I don't really think it is worth the effort to raise them at all. Yeah, so anyway, let's talk more about other composting worms. So the Canadian nightcrawlers, they're very good composting worms, and these worms are very good at handling cooler temperatures. So if you live in colder regions like where I am, then they will do well in the winter, but then they won't do so well in the summer, even though I'm in a cold region. Unless, of course, you can have them in an area where you are able to keep them cool all year round, because once the temperature reach about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, then that is more than they can handle. So if you're raising Canadian nightcrawlers, then you have to be able to keep them cool. Now, these Canadian nightcrawlers, sometimes some people will call them dew worms. Sometimes they will say Canadian nightcrawlers, but if they say dew worms, then you know they're talking about the Canadian nightcrawlers. So the best way to raise your Canadian nightcrawlers, if you are not in an area that is cool enough, excuse me, and if you can't keep them cool, is to keep them in your refrigerator, because they can survive in your refrigerator for very, very, very long time. Just make sure that you provide them with food. It's just that if you have them in the refrigerator, they won't be reproducing as fast as if you just simply have them in a cool environment. Yes, so if you put them in the refrigerator, they're going to slow down, but at the same time, they will continue to reproduce, and you have to feed them from time to time. And they are big. They're usually pretty big. They can grow up to even 14 inches in length. And I think this is why most people who goes fishing love to use them, because they are so big. I was offered free wood chips, and then I found out what brought them in. There is a tree service that chips up remove trees near the woods. Oh, so that is how you end up with those jumping worms. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry you have to come in contact with them and the damage that they're causing in your region. Now, the Canadian nightcrawlers, another reason why people like to use them for fishing is that they can survive for even up to 5 minutes when you place them in the water. So that makes them ideal for fishing. Now, for people like me who love to fish, I wish I could actually raise them all year round, but for some reason, they always tend to die off in the summer, and then whatever eggs or cocoons are in the bin would stay there and hatch eventually. So the population doesn't really die off, but then they don't tend to reproduce so much because they're constantly dying off. So unfortunately, I no longer have them, but well, I put them in my garden. I haven't come across any of them yet, though. I put quite a few of them in the garden over the past couple months, but I haven't come across any of them. I don't know if they're hiding from me or the temperature. It really is hot, so maybe they would have, yeah. I guess that's why I haven't seen them yet. Maybe sometime in the fall or close to the fall, I might be able to see them, but for now, I think they're gonna stay down low. I agree with you, Russell. That is sad. Not Russell, I mean LP. But what is the difference between the earthworms and the compost worms? One, as I mentioned before, the earthworms are not good at living in confinement because they need to be able to burrow down deeply. Yes, but both of them are reddish in color, and the earthworms, they tend to be more reddish brown, and they are usually between a quarter inch to 6 inches. Sometimes they do go longer than 6 inches. The red wrigglers are usually 2 to 3 inches. Sometimes they grow up to 4 inches, but mostly they're an average of about 3 inches. And the red wrigglers tend to be a reddish purple in color, and then the tip of their tails tend to be yellowish. Now, some red wrigglers may have stripes on them as well. So sometimes you will see stripes similar to what you will find on the European nightcrawlers. The red wrigglers like to live in organic matter, and some of the nightcrawlers will live in organic matter, although they tend to bridge between the soil and organic matter for the nightcrawlers. But then regular earthworms, they don't live in organic matter. They cannot live in the organic matter. So they live in the soil. And then when it's time to feed, they come up, take the food, and bring it back down to where they live. And then they will have their feast. But they will not do well if you put them in just organic matter, which is another reason why these regular earthworms are not good for raising them in compost bins. But it's good to have them around though, because you can still get the benefits that you will get if you were raising them in a bin, if you work at increasing the population of them in your garden. See, Russell says, Granddaddy's in a bin that is shallow works much better for composting than a deeper bin. The deeper bins will tend to allow them to make burrows. Okay. Yeah. Now, one of the difference between composting worms and regular earthworms is that composting worms are not good for tilling the soil, whereas the regular earthworms will till the soil. Now, some composting worms will till the soil. The red wrigglers will not. But then the night crawlers, they will do well whether or not they're in the soil or they're in the organic matter. So the night crawlers are good soil tillers, but not the red wrigglers. So the earthworms, they're more ideal if you keep them in outdoor gardens. Now the composting worms, a lot of time you may not be able to just go outside and find them in your backyard, whereas regular earthworms, you can find them in your backyard. And the more organic matter you have in your backyard, the more likely it is that you're going to find regular earthworms. But there are some regions where you might be able to just go in your backyard and find composting worms. For the Canadian nightcrawlers, if you go in the woods here, you might be able to find them. Or if you know of farms that raise animals, then you might be able to find the Canadian nightcrawlers there because they like to feed on the animals' byproduct. So, yes, sometimes you can find them. I know that for Ann White, she can just find lots and lots of both the Canadian nightcrawlers and the European nightcrawlers in her backyard because that's how she got her worm bin started. Funny enough, though, I was talking to her about that the other day, and she was saying that she has the Canadian nightcrawlers. Of course, she didn't know it was the Canadian nightcrawlers at that point in time, but she was always wondering what type of worms they are. But when her worm bin got started because of the holes that was in her compost bin, surprisingly, the Canadian nightcrawlers did not go in that bin. It's just the European nightcrawlers that actually go in the bin and stayed in there and keep on reproducing until she's got quite a few well-established worm bin, which is what I find interesting because you would think that the Canadian nightcrawlers would go in there to feed, even if they're not going to stay. But she's never seen the Canadian nightcrawlers in the bin. It's quite interesting. Let's see. Russell says, when they burrow, they come to the top, but not out of the burrow. Okay. When they are out on top, they compost great. Okay. Selfie says, I found a worm of the Actolation genus, a composting worm here in Michigan. I wanted to see if I could raise them, but left them outside and most escaped. Then those I brought inside did not survive. Oh. Okay, one survived. In fact, I need to see if it is still there. I wonder if we can get CNCs in Michigan. It's not really difficult to get the Canadian night crawlers, but again, if you're living in an hot environment, then you're gonna have to do what you can to keep them cool because they just cannot handle the heat. Okay, so because red regulars reproduce so rapidly and they are surface dwellers, that makes them very good composters. But how long does it take the Canadian night crawlers to reach maturity? They take 4 to 6 weeks to reach maturity. So unlike the red wrigglers, they do take a little bit longer in order to reach their maturity state. When So within 10 to 55 weeks, these Canadian nightcrawlers will actually reach their full potential in terms of growth. But that is a wide range because 10 to 55 weeks for them to actually reach their maturity rate. And I guess that might be dependent on the temperature at the time during their growth. So I guess if the temperature is good, then they will reach their maturity rate. They will take their time to grow, but then the more they feel threatened because of the heat or whatever the case may be, then they might want to reach their speed up their maturity rate because then they need to do whatever they can to preserve their species. Yeah, I wish I could raise them without having to create a cool environment for them because then I could get to observe them more and get to learn more about them. But I guess that's not meant to be. Maybe not for now anyway. If in the future I'm in a position where I can raise them and keep them cool, then be able to observe them some more. I was wondering if maybe I should buy another set of them and keep them in the house and raise them there, but I don't think it is going to work because we tend to keep our temperatures more on the warmer side than the cooler side. So I guess maybe I'll just have to wait and see if, for whatever reason, my circumstances might change where I am able to keep them cool. But if I have to go out of my way to keep them cool, then that's going to be too much work for me. I am always so busy. I don't want to create unnecessary work for myself. Although sometimes the result that you get might be worth it, but I'm already bombarded with things to do, so I don't think I'm going to go that route. In Michigan, they should be at bait shops in the refrigerator. Okay. So the CNC like to stay down deep. I read once composting worms are divided into three categories based on the layer they prefer to inhabit. Oh, okay. Yes, they do like to, if the time is cool, then they're not going to really, they don't have a reason to stay down deep because the deeper they go, the less organic matter they're going to have access to. But if the time is hot, they're definitely going to stay down deep because the deeper they are, the cooler they are going to be. So, yes, when the time is hot, they're definitely not going to be coming up to the surface. Yeah, in the basement, unheated, that's depend on how cool or how hot it is down there. Yeah, because it might be cool to us, but then it might be hot to them because they like temperatures 40 degrees Fahrenheit is okay for them. They don't mind the temperatures being low. So if you're going to be raising these Canadian night crawlers, you either gonna have to find a way to keep them cool, whether you're going to be constantly putting high spot in them, or if you have an AC, then you'd have to keep your AC running and keep them close to the AC, or keeping them in your refrigerator. If you put them in the refrigerator, they will go into a semi hibernative state. So I don't know if it is worth it to have them in a refrigerator if they're going to be in that state because you want them to be active and be eating and reproducing fast. So I don't really know if it is worth it, but I guess like for me in Saskatchewan, that would be an option because we only have 3 months of really warm weather. The other 9 months is fairly cool. So I guess I could keep them in the fridge for 3 months and then during the cooler months I just put them back out into the garage. Okay, something like that would work. Come to think of it. Yeah. Well, if that would work, Maybe I'll try it. I don't know. But I don't want to, and I'm afraid of it. I don't want to get them and try it and then it doesn't work and they die because then I'm going to feel bad. I'm going to feel sorry for them if they should die. Russell says a Canadian nightcrawler out of the ground acts differently than one in the ground. Once out of the ground, for them to get back in is like running into a wall. Oh, wow, really interesting. Oh, yes. So they can tolerate temperatures up to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Anything above that, they will actually start to die off. Yeah, that is strange that they are not able to find their way back in. Okay, so your recommendation is not over 55 Fahrenheit. Okay. Yes, and I guess you have far more experience with raising them when you used to raise them than I do because I've only had them for a very short period of time. So, yes, so based on the recommendation that have been given, 65 is okay, but because you have more experience, then yeah, they can tolerate up to 50, sorry, up to 60 Fahrenheit before they start dying. Okay. Yes, I agree with you, LP. That is not an easy temperature to maintain. I would be cold, so if I'm gonna be keeping them indoors and keeping them at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm going to be cold. And I don't like being cold, so it's between me or the worms, and I choose me. Oh, Lord. Yeah. Um, I guess so. It depends on how to what extent the material will heat up. Yeah, it depends on to what temperature the material will heat up because the temperatures can go pretty high, but then how high it goes also depend on the quantity of material that you have. So, person says, I do not do Canadian Nightcrawlers anymore. I started with granddaddies in the 80s, in 86. Yes, that would be cold indeed. Okay, so you want to know what granddaddies are. Well, they're the same Canadian Nightcrawlers. I assume they are mature, older Canadian Nightcrawlers, but I guess Russell will tell you what it is that he calls the granddaddies. Let's see. If I still had them, they would be in the basement with cold water circulating in the bottom of the beds. Yeah, that is so much work. That is a lot of work. I don't know. These days, I'm trying to scale back on the amount of work that I have to do because sometimes I don't even know my right hand from my left foot. And when I get so overwhelmed with work, sometimes I tend to start making a lot of mistakes because I'm just too tired to think straight. So I'm just trying to scale back on the amount of things that I have to do. So if I have to raise them and I'm going to have all that work, then it's just too much for me. Yeah, you said too. It's too sounds like too much work as well. Yeah, and then you have to with the Canadian night crawlers. It's not like the red wigglers and the European night crawlers or the African night crawlers or the blue worms. With the Canadian night crawlers, you have to change their bedding quite regularly too. Yeah, you have to change at least 10% of their bedding every 4 to 6 months. You just have to keep changing a portion of their bedding. So I don't know if I'm gonna want that amount of work. When I was raising them, I really honestly didn't change any bedding for them. When they run out of bedding, I will add more bedding material. But to say taking out a percentage of it and putting in new, no, I've never really done that. Okay, so Granddaddy, when you talk about the Granddaddy, it is actually growing large night crawlers in advanced worm husbandry. Okay, cool. Yeah, so LP says I guess I won't try. I won't be trying to raise them after all. Yes, it takes a lot. It takes a lot to raise them. Um, if you are going to be raising them, then first of all, you want to use a cover for your bin that is going to maximize airflow. And from time to time, you're going to need to remove the lid of the bin so that you can increase the airflow in the bin. You're going to have to water the bin regularly. And then you're going to have to be very careful to ensure that you don't do, if you're watering a bin, you're not making any drastic changes to the temperature in the bin, because whether it is European night crawlers, Canadian night crawlers, red wrigglers, or whatever the word may be, they don't like drastic changes in temperature. But then the Canadian night crawlers can be even more finicky. Yes, I agree with you, Russell. Red wrigglers definitely are the way to go because they require the least amount of care, and then they can survive such a wide range of changes, whether temperature wise, whether it is moisture wise, because whereas other type of worms might die off because they don't have enough moisture, the red wrigglers, they will die off too because naturally they need to breathe through their skin, but they need the moisture in order to breathe through their skin. But when you have them in your bin and if for some reason you forget about them, they can survive with the minimal amount of water in the bin, whereas the other type of worms, for some reason, for those that I have raised anyway, tend to seem to die very quickly as soon as the bin starts to dry out too much. So the red wrigglers, they are quite resilient. Okay, so these worms, all the composting worms, usually can live up to around 10 years. There are circumstances where they live longer than that, but the composting worms usually tend to live for up to 10 years. And they live longer when they are in confinement than when they're out in the wild, provided you're caring for them in confinement. Then they tend to live longer than when they're out in the wild, because when they're out in the wild, they tend to become prey to all other sorts of animals. Let's see, LP says, I agree. I've actually done really well with blue worms. I don't use a lid and they don't travel except maybe one or two here and there. But honestly, I find dead worms, so could be European night crawlers or red wrigglers. Okay. Okay, so why do night crawlers really feed at night? They tend to feed at night because they need moisture. In the day, it is usually very hot. One, they don't like light. No worms like light, as far as I know, because they prefer the darkness, and then light usually relates to heat, and heat tends to dry them out, and then they can't breathe properly. In the evenings or the night, it tends to be moisture and cooler, so they can last longer if they should come out of their natural habitat. And so, to minimize the risk of being dehydrated by the sun, so they will tend to feed at night. So they were given the name Nightcrawlers. Now, can they survive in water? They can. All worms can survive, all of the composting worms can survive in water, but then it depends on how aerated the water is. So if it is a situation where the worms are in, say, for example, an hydroponic system that has regular airflow in it, then they can survive in that system. But if it is the case where they're going to be in a body of standing water that is not having any air exchange, then they are definitely going to drown, because what's going to happen is that there is no air pocket in the standing water for them to be able to breathe. So it will result in them drowning. Now, worms, I was mentioning earlier that when you put the Canadian nightcrawlers in the fridge, that they tend to hibernate. But worms really, they don't hibernate. They go into a similar situation to hibernating, but then it is not called hibernation. It is called estivation, and this is where they curl up tightly, and then they will slow down their metabolism. So they don't hibernate, but instead they estivate. Let's see. LP says, even when it storms, my blues don't travel. Nice. I keep them in a storage bin, so kind of deep. Okay, that's good. Yeah, nice to know that they're not traveling, because I hear that they can travel really far and wide. And because of that, a lot of worm farmers have had these blue worms invade most of their worm bins, because these worms just like to go on a tour. Let's see, Russell says, although the blues are a different species, I still consider them red wrigglers, as that is the way they are sold. Uncle Jim does not profess to sell Icenia fetida only, he sells red wrigglers. Yes, he does make it known on his website that his worms are a combination of different types of worms. When I started with worms, Lumbricus rubellus was known as the red worms. Okay, yeah. Because I do notice that sometimes when I'm doing research, I notice that it's not just the red wrigglers that they refer to as red worms. So sometimes it can be confusing for readers, because there are several different types of worms that they from time to time will refer to as red worms. But okay, so that's you got your worms from Uncle Jim and LP. That's how you ended up with blue worms. Yeah. I've never really seen a blue worm, neither have I had one. Never raised them, because I don't really think they would do well in my environment. It's just too cold. If my red wrigglers that can tolerate such a wide range of temperature change could not manage my garage this winter, then without a doubt, the blue worms that loves the warm environment would definitely not survive here at all, unless I can keep the entire garden at the same, not garden but garage at the same temperature. LP says, I know some of the blues have traveled to the neighboring ENC bin, but they don't migrate in mass like many people have described. Okay, well, that's good. That's good. Okay, you like the blue worms. I wanted to raise them I was actually thinking of doing so sometime. Was that late last year or early this year? But then looking into them and the type of temperature that they need, and I know the type of temperature that I can provide. So I decided not to go that route, but I'd really like to grow all of the composting worms and be able to compare them, see which one does best in what circumstance, which one eats more, which one produce more casting. It would be nice if I could raise all of them and observe them separately, but I guess that's not an option at the moment. Hopefully, with time, I will be able to. But to do that, I would have to have a designated worm farm, and then I can have separate rooms where I monitor temperatures depending on what each type of worm prefer. But yeah, who knows? Maybe in the future I'll be able to do that. Then I will have myself some more fun. But we'll see. If not, then that's quite fine too. Let's see. If you could keep them inside, say in the basement, you could. Mine are in the basement all year. In the winter, it drops into the 40s, 50s. The red river population went up, but then blue bin stayed at least 55. Okay, yeah. Well, I'd love to be able to keep them in my basement, but I don't really have anywhere where I could keep them. There's nowhere in my basement that I could keep them. And then I guess old master wouldn't be too happy with me having them in the house, although I do have some worms in the house because I always keep a pound of my red regulars in the house just in case of emergency and something should happen to the worms that I have outdoors. Then at least I will know that I have a pound of worms that I can use to rebuild the population, but I don't have any more space inside where I could put another bin for that purpose. And then because I couldn't put them where I have the red regulars if they're going to be traveling because I don't want the two worms to be in the same container. But yeah. So how did you guys get started in worm farming in the first place? How did you learn about worm farming? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the type of temperatures that these various composting worms prefer. So the type of temperature that they prefer all depend on the type of worms. So like for the red wrigglers, they can stand at temperatures between 50 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 10 to 25 degrees Celsius. The blue worms, they prefer temperatures between 45 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So they can manage far more heat than the red wigglers. And the ENC, they prefer between 45 and 70. And then the ANC, they are similar to the blue worms because they prefer temperatures between 60 and 95. So between the blue worms and the African nightcrawlers, the African nightcrawlers are best at handling the heat because and they are the worst at handling cooler temperatures because the blue worm can handle a bit of cool temperature, but then the African nightcrawlers definitely cannot handle anything below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Canadian nightcrawlers, they cannot manage anything above 80, well, not 80, but 60, as Russell says, 60 or 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're gonna be living in a cool environment and you want to raise worms, then naturally the Canadian nightcrawlers would be the way to grow. And then if you're in the warm environment, naturally you're gonna go with the African nightcrawlers or the blue worms. And then for it doesn't really matter what temperature you're in for the red wrigglers and the blue worms, as long as it's not supernova, they can do well in the warmer or cooler temperatures. Okay, you're home. Good. Time to move on to your next project, eh? I was gonna say time for you to get some rest, but I know there's no rest for you. Gosh. But yes, at least you're home. That's good. Let's see. He says, I started gardening and was researching compost and found Gardener Scott's YouTube channel about starting your own worm brain. I, I dove into the material then. That's how I found you too. Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad you found me. I enjoy talking to you and learning about your experiences with your worm and your garden. Yeah. I don't know. I think most of you here who raise worms actually enjoy worm farming, right? It is fun. I find it to be quite relaxing. Yes, and even when I am not able to do anything for them, sometimes I just like to go out and look at the worms. Sometimes I go out there and talk to them. They must be wondering, oh, what is this crazy woman doing here talking to us? Okay, you feel the same, LP. Okay, good. Let's see, Rosie Schroeder. Okay, Schroeder. His firm name was Herman. Herman the worm. I remember you telling me about him, so I did a little research on him. Yes. Okay. Yeah, so I got started similar to you, LP, because compost was what I was actually researching because with my short growing season here, I wanted to increase the rate at which my compost is produced. Trying to, so I started doing research on how I can speed up my composting rate. And I saw many different suggestions, including some saying that you can have compost in as little as 14 days. I've never tried that, but yes, they're saying if you use things like lettuces and grass clippings, anything that doesn't really have any hard stem in it, anything that is easy to break down, and with certain types of additives, then they can give you compost in 14 days. I don't know how true it is because I've never really tried it, but yes, from doing those research and compost, I came across information, and I was quite fortunate to find worms because in my region at that point in time it was not easy to find people who are into vermicomposting. But these days it seems quite a few more people are becoming more and more aware of vermicomposting, mostly because of social media. Because once you're into gardening now, a lot of information regarding worm farming will just pop up onto your social media. So more and more people are getting familiar with the compost worms in my region, which is good because it's good for business for me. The only bad thing is that um, I don't really produce enough worms that I can keep up with the market. That is pretty sad. Yeah, it's a little. If I was in an environment where I had even 6 months of the year being warm, then I would have been able to keep up with the market. But it's a little bit too cold here for too long. But I guess eventually, after I finish working on my garage, I'll at least be able to monitor the temperatures in there, and that will help me to build up my worm population some more. So I guess during the next couple of months, I'll be working hard at getting the garage to where I want it. Yeah. I bought the mesh to secure the worm shells, and it's been sitting there for about 3 weeks now. I still can't find the time to get the mesh installed, but I was able to at least make a few of the covers for the worm bin, covers that are going to keep out the smaller flying creatures like the fruit flies and stuff like that. So I managed to cut a few of them and I managed to sew a few of them. So I'm feeling optimistic that I will be able to get it done before the cold weather starts, because even if it gets cold in the fall, the worms will still be okay in the garage. But once it reaches January or even late December, they won't be so happy as it's gonna be cold in there. So definitely I need to work on the door, but there is so much I need to do before I can actually touch that door, because that garage, all the work that I did in there in the winter, I still haven't been able to tidy up that region yet, so I can't do anything to the door. But with time, I think I'll be able to get to it and get it done before the freezing temperature begin. Hi, mom. Okay, you were on the road too. Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you were at least able to drop by and say hello. Yeah. So anyway, I'm gonna be saying goodbye to you guys shortly, because I'm expecting someone to drop by pretty soon. Yes, but it was nice talking with you all. Got to learn a little bit more from you guys too, so that's always good. Yes, so thank you guys for your input. I'm sure I'm not the only one learning from you. There are others learning from you guys as well. Let's see. Oh, you have concluded the yeast experiment. It's a no go. Oh, yeah, that's disappointing. Very disappointing. Yeah. I'd forgotten about it though. I forgot that you were doing that experiment, but at least you were able to come to a conclusion regarding that. So thanks for sharing the experiment with us. We really appreciate that. Okay, same to you, LP. Have a wonderful weekend. And to all of you guys, I hope you thoroughly enjoy your weekend and that you will stay safe. Enjoy your worm farming and your gardening. Hope to see you again, if possible, on Monday. Okay, so have a lovely evening.